In a matter of hours, the federal government's flood insurance program received $620 million in claims from a single 12-mile-long island. That figure was nearly 100 times more than Sanibel had cost the program in the previous 4 decades combined. The Causeway, the only road connecting this barrier island to the Florida mainland, was ripped apart in 5 separate places, its concrete and asphalt dropped into the Gulf like pieces of a broken toy. 6,500 people lived there. 200 households refused to evacuate. The storm surge hit 15 feet. And here's the part that should scare anyone who owns coastal property anywhere in America. Sanibel wasn't some reckless, overdeveloped beach strip. It was the most carefully protected barrier island in the entire country. 2/3 of it was conservation land. No building over 3 stories, no fast food chains. The residents had spent 50 years fighting off developers, lawsuits, and county government to keep the world out. What they couldn't keep out was the water. The island sits less than 5 feet above sea level. Hold those 2 numbers next to each other. 5 feet of land, 15 feet of water, and you understand what overwash means. But the story of Sanibel isn't really about the hurricane. The hurricane was the last act. The real story is about a 3-mile road across the water that made everything on this island possible, and about how everything it made possible could disappear in a single afternoon. The Causeway, built once for $2.73 million, rebuilt once for $137 million, destroyed by Hurricane Ian on September 28, 2022. Rebuilt again for $328 million. That bridge is the entire economic history of Sanibel Island compressed into concrete and steel. Every dollar that ever flowed into this place, every real estate deal, every tourist season, every retirement nest egg, crossed that causeway. And every time the causeway breaks, the island stops existing as anything more than a patch of sand. Before the bridge, Sanibel was practically empty. The island is only about 6,000 years old. Geologically speaking, it's a baby. It separated from the mainland as sea levels rose in the Gulf of Mexico, which means it was forming while the pyramids of Egypt were being built. The Calusa people had lived there for more than 2,000 years, dominating a large stretch of southwest Florida through trade and an elaborate system of canals and waterways they carved through the mangroves. They were shell people. They used shells as tools, weapons, jewelry, and building material, and they left behind enormous shell mounds that still mark the island's highest elevations, which tells you something about Sanibel. Its tallest natural points are piles of discarded oyster shells left by people who were here before Columbus. When Juan Ponce de Leon attempted to settle on the island in 1513, the Calusa chased him off. The Spanish came back and eventually gave the island its name, probably derived from Queen Isabella, though the origin has never been confirmed with certainty. A harbor on Sanibel first appeared on a map in 1765. Puerto de S. Nivel. Florida passed from Spain to Britain in exchange for Cuba in 1763, and then the island drifted through colonial hands until American settlers arrived. For most of the 19th century, Sanibel sat mostly vacant. A handful of fishermen, a scattering of homesteaders trying to grow things. In 1832, a company called the Florida Peninsular Land Company tried to market the island as a planned community that would become the Garden of Florida, plotting 50 home sites on the east end and dividing the rest into farming tracts. A few pioneers planted sugarcane, pineapple, and corn. Then the U.S. government ordered the farmers to abandon their land, fearing they might support the remaining Seminole population in the area. The island emptied again. In 1833, the first settlers petitioned the federal government for a lighthouse. Congress took 50 years to say yes. When the money finally came through, $50,000 appropriated in 1883, the construction crew faced a problem that sounds like something out of a novel. The ship carrying the ironwork for the lighthouse sank 2 miles off the coast of Sanibel. The iron for a second, nearly identical lighthouse at Cape San Blas in the Florida Panhandle was aboard the same vessel. Hard hat divers from Key West went down and fished up every single piece, except 2 small gallery brackets, which were refabricated by a shop in New Orleans. The tower was assembled on a screw pile foundation that had already been completed, and on August 20th, 1884, the Sanibel Lighthouse, Point Ebell Light, was lit for the first time. 98 feet tall, iron skeleton frame, powered by kerosene oil, carried up a 127-step spiral staircase by the keeper, Dudley Richardson. It still stands, and in a strange way, it's the first clue about Sanibel's character. Everything on this island has been built, lost, and recovered at least once. The lighthouse brought attention. Homesteaders followed, and by the turn of the century, Sanibel had found its first real economy: tomatoes. The island had a 9-month growing season, unusually fertile soil, and easy boat access to East Coast cities. Sanibel tomatoes were not ordinary produce. They appeared on the menus at New York's finest restaurants and hotels during the Roaring '20s. A single Sanibel tomato cost $1.50, the equivalent of about $25 today. Farmers shipped them north by boat and rail, and for a brief, unlikely period, this tiny barrier island in the Gulf of Mexico was one of the most productive agricultural patches in the state of Florida. The Bailey family, who'd arrived in the 1880s, ran the general store and became the closest thing the island had to an economic dynasty. Their name still appears on buildings, roads, and the Shell Museum. Then in 1926, a hurricane covered the entire island in salt water. The soil was poisoned overnight. Commercial farming on Sanibel was finished, just like that. Decades of agricultural development, the packing houses, the shipping operations, the carefully tended fields, destroyed by a single storm. It was the first time Sanibel learned a lesson it would have to relearn almost a century later. Everything you build on a barrier island exists at the pleasure of the Gulf. But something else had already been taking root. Visitors had been arriving by ferry since 1912, drawn by the quiet beaches and, above all, by the shells. Sanibel's shape is the key to its most famous attraction. Most barrier islands run parallel to the coast, long and narrow, like fingers. Sanibel curves. It hooks east to west, forming a crescent that acts like a giant scoop, catching shells swept along the Gulf's currents and depositing them on the beach in astonishing concentrations. More than 300 species wash ashore, over 400 by some counts. The phenomenon became so iconic that shell collectors developed their own posture, bent at the waist, eyes fixed on the sand, shuffling through ankle-deep water at dawn. They call it the Sanibel Stoop. It's been the island's signature image for over a century. Every morning, dozens of people do it. Within 5 minutes of walking the beach, you're doing it too. Finding a Junonia, a rare spotted shell that shows up maybe once a season, is such an event that the local newspaper traditionally published photos of the lucky finder. Henry Ford and Thomas Edison visited the island regularly, searching for shells and plant specimens. The island's first lodging, a small place called the Sisters, opened in 1898. Tourism crept in slowly because geography forced it to. The ferry from Punta Rasa was unreliable. The waits were long, and the island had essentially no infrastructure. The isolation was the charm. It was also the ceiling. Then came Hugo Lindgren, and the ceiling shattered. Lindgren was born in Sweden, arrived in the United States with nothing, and worked his way into manufacturing. He founded a kitchen cabinet company in Jamestown, New York, called Jamestown Metal Products. When the White House was refurbished in 1948, Lindgren's company won the contract to install the kitchen cabinets. He sold the business in 1962, turned his attention to Florida, and bought a large tract of property on Sanibel Island. And Lindgren saw something that most islanders either couldn't see or actively refused to see. This island was worth a fortune. but only if you could drive to it. In 1955, a feasibility study had concluded that a bridge to the mainland would cost double the first 10 years' projected income. The project died. But Lindgren, who knew a thing or two about making numbers work, approached the Lee County Board of Commissioners in 1959 with a new proposal. He wrote a personal check for $180,000 to fund a fresh engineering and feasibility study. This time, the math was different. The project was viable. 2 years of fierce, sometimes ugly argument followed. Many longtime residents opposed the bridge. They understood, correctly, that a road would change everything. The final approval hearing in November 1961 was so heated that police were called to restore order. Lindgren organized a consortium that bought the entire Causeway bond issue, roughly $4.5 million. He then granted the county right-of-way through his own property for the bridge's island terminus, after the Bailey family refused to allow the originally planned route through their land. Construction took 15 months. On May 26, 1963, the Sanibel Causeway opened for traffic. Lindgren charged a $5 toll, over $40 in today's money. The 3 bridges spanned San Carlos Bay, connected by 2 artificial islands created from dredged material. The engineer was Hector Estrup of Caribbean Engineers. It was the last major project he ever designed. The impact was instantaneous. That first day the causeway opened, the islanders who had fought against it could practically hear the future pulling up. Developers and builders swarmed onto the island. Condominiums, hotels, residential subdivisions, all of it went up fast. The population had hovered around 250 for decades. Within a few years, it was growing rapidly, heading toward the thousands. The wildfires of 1955, one of the practical arguments for the bridge, since firefighters couldn't reach the island quickly by ferry, were forgotten. The new problem was concrete, not fire. And here is where Sanibel's story takes its most important turn, because what happened next doesn't happen almost anywhere else in coastal America. Lee County's existing zoning would have allowed 30,000 residential units on Sanibel Island. That's a projected population of 90,000, roughly the same as Miami Beach. County planners in 1968 recommended the island for high-intensity urban development and a 4-lane expressway. Someone proposed high-rise towers along Tarpon Bay. Someone else dreamed up a mangrove highway, an elevated roadway connecting all the barrier islands from Naples to Charlotte Harbor, with off-ramps at each one, like some kind of tropical interstate running over the mangroves. Sanibel was about to become another Fort Lauderdale. The people already living there decided otherwise, and 3 of the ringleaders happened to be former CIA agents. Porter Goss had retired to Sanibel in his early 40s after leaving the Central Intelligence Agency. He and his wife Marielle bought a big house on the island's largely uninhabited north end. With 2 other former spies, Francis Whitehead and Fred Valentine, Goss launched a newspaper called The Island Reporter in 1973. It became the voice of a full-scale civic rebellion. The residents had earlier persuaded the state to create a Sanibel Planning and Zoning Authority, an independent body with power over development. But a court struck it down, handing control back to the pro-growth Lee County Commission. The county cooperated with the local Chamber of Commerce to fight incorporation. A county commissioner wrote directly to Sanibel residents, urging them to give up the idea. Developers circled. The pro-incorporation forces ran a grassroots campaign that used the Island Reporter as their main platform. On November 5, 1974, 84% of Sanibel's registered voters turned out. The vote was 689 to 394, 64% in favor of incorporation. The city of Sanibel was born. Getting the money to fund the new city was its own adventure. A bank that had promised a loan to underwrite the first year's operations decided the deal was too risky and pulled back. Instead, it issued subscription notes, essentially I owe us, that individual residents could buy. The notes were oversubscribed in the first 2 days. These people put their own money behind their own government. That tells you everything about the kind of community this was. Porter Goss became the first mayor. The council, Goss, Vernon McKenzie, Charles LaBeouf, Z. Butler, and Francis Bailey, immediately imposed a moratorium on new construction and hired a planning firm from Philadelphia to design a comprehensive land use plan. The Sanibel Plan, formally adopted on July 19, 1976, was revolutionary. Instead of zoning based on market demand or conventional growth projections, it zoned based on the island's ecological carrying capacity. Each parcel was classified by its environmental sensitivity. Building heights were capped. Density was restricted. No fast food or chain restaurants beyond those already operating. Developers sued. They sued repeatedly. They lost every single time. The irony is both beautiful and brutal. The bridge that Hugo Lindgren built to unlock the island's value triggered the political movement that locked its development in place forever. Lindgren had handed Sanibel to the future. The future said, "No, thank you, we'll stay as we are." Lindgren lived to be 100 years old, dying in Fort Myers in 2003. The boulevard where the causeway meets the island still carries his name. But the conservation story goes back even further than the rebellion. In the early 1940s, the state of Florida had planned to sell over 2,000 acres of state-owned land on Sanibel to developers. This would have opened the island's interior to whatever the market wanted to put there. A two-time Pulitzer Prize-winning editorial cartoonist named J. Norwood Ding Darling, who had been spending winters on the island since the early 1900s and who was deeply attached to its birds and mangroves, learned about the sale and moved to block it. Darling was no ordinary artist with a hobby. He'd been drawing political cartoons for the Des Moines Register for decades, often making conservation the subject of his work. In 1934, President Roosevelt appointed him chief of the newly formed U.S. Biological Survey, the agency that would become the Fish and Wildlife Service. In just 20 months on the job, Darling helped reshape federal wildlife policy and created the federal Duck Stamp Program, whose proceeds funded migratory bird conservation. He put up $9,000 of his own money to help launch cooperative wildlife research at Iowa State College. The man drew cartoons for a living and changed how America treated its wildlife. When Darling heard about the Florida land sale, he went to work. He convinced Governor Spessard Holland to postpone the sale, persuaded the state to create a wildlife sanctuary, and then lobbied the Truman administration to go further. Truman signed an executive order in 1945 establishing the Sanibel National Wildlife Refuge. When Darling died in 1962, islanders rallied to rename it in his honor. Today, the J.N. Ding Darling National Wildlife Refuge covers more than 6,300 acres of mangrove forest, cordgrass marshes, and West Indian hardwood hammocks, the largest undeveloped mangrove ecosystem in the United States, home to more than 245 species of birds. Roughly 2,800 acres are designated federal wilderness. A cartoonist saved it. Between Darling's Refuge and the Sanibel Plan, over 60% of the island, roughly 7,000 of its 11,600 acres, was permanently removed from development. What remained was capped at roughly 9,000 total dwelling units, about 4,700 single-family homes and duplexes, 3,100 condominiums, 700 hotel rooms, and a few hundred timeshares and manufactured homes. That's it. Forever. The city projected it would reach full build-out around 2025, and by the early 2010s, it was nearly there. On an island the same physical size as Manhattan, where 1.6 million people live and work, Sanibel chose to house fewer than 7,000. No chain restaurants were permitted, except two that had been grandfathered in. No building taller than 3 stories was allowed after 1974. The only structures that rose above the tree line were the ones built during the brief window between the causeway opening in 1963 and the plan taking effect in 1976. Everything built after that stayed low, stayed back from the road, stayed quiet. Sanibel became something that almost doesn't exist in coastal Florida. A barrier island where the trees were taller than the buildings, where there were no streetlights, not one, because they would disturb the nesting sea turtles, where the main road, Periwinkle Way, ran through a natural tunnel of buttonwoods, palms, mangroves, and live oaks that arched overhead like the ceiling of a green cathedral, where 25 miles of shared-use paths meant people biked more than they drove, where the streets went quiet by 9 o'clock at night and stayed quiet until morning, when the only sounds were birds and the soft crash of waves depositing another few thousand shells on the sand. Over 3 million vehicles a year crossed the causeway. A 2017 count measured it precisely. But the island never felt crowded because there was simply no infrastructure to accommodate a crowd. No neon, no high-rise hotels casting shadows on the beach, no boardwalk. Just low-slung buildings tucked behind vegetation, painted in muted beach colors, barely visible from the road. The annual Sanibel Shell Fair and Show drew collectors from around the world every March. The big Arts Cultural Center hosted jazz concerts and dance performances. The Ding Darling Refuge welcomed more than 1 million visitors a year to drive its 5-mile wildlife drive, where you could spot roseate spoonbills, white ibis, and 8-foot alligators crunching horseshoe crabs. The island had figured out how to let millions of people visit without letting millions of people change it. Real estate prices reflected the scarcity like a mirror. During the COVID years of 2020 and 2021, sales surged as remote workers realized they could live anywhere. In 2020, 289 single-family homes sold on Sanibel. In 2021, at the peak of the frenzy, 355 sold. By the time Hurricane Ian arrived, the average home value had climbed to nearly $1.3 million. Many of these weren't mansions. They were modest, single-story beach houses, cottages, and bungalows, some dating back decades, that happened to occupy land whose development would never be replicated. The value wasn't in the building. It was in the restriction. You were paying for what could never be built next door. Insurance companies loved Sanibel. The island hadn't experienced a hurricane of real consequence in years. Risk was calculated using historical models that looked backward, not forward. The National Flood Insurance Program had paid out only a few $1 million to Sanibel homeowners over 4 entire decades. Premiums were manageable. The actuarial table said everything was fine. Sanibel was, in the language of the insurance industry, a dream account. The dream was about to end in one afternoon. At approximately 3 in the afternoon on September 28, 2022, Hurricane Ian made landfall near Cayo Costa, about 20 miles from Fort Myers. It was a high-end Category 4 storm with sustained winds near 150 miles per hour, 5 short of Category 5. The storm drove a wall of seawater directly across Sanibel Island. In some areas, the surge hit 12 feet above ground level. In others, 15. On an island that sits less than 5 feet above sea level, the water didn't just flood the ground floors, it submerged entire structures. Sanibel didn't get flooded, it got swallowed. The causeway took 5 major breaches. 50 to 65 feet of roadway collapsed. Sections of ramp, sections of road, sections of bridge, all torn away and deposited in San Carlos Bay. By the following morning, Sanibel was cut off. No cars, no supply trucks, no ambulances. The only way on or off the island was by helicopter or by hiring a boat captain to ferry you across. Some residents paid boat operators just to get back and survey the damage. Governor Ron DeSantis used one word to describe Sanibel at a press conference: destruction. He added that the island had been hit with what he called biblical storm surge. Not everyone had left. Roughly 200 households rode it out. An older couple who'd stayed in their home on Sanibel couldn't agree on whether to evacuate after the causeway was destroyed. He wanted to go, she hesitated, and eventually rescue teams arrived by boat to settle the argument for them. Mayor Holly Smith had evacuated Tuesday night. From 15 miles away on the mainland, she fielded calls she couldn't answer and made promises she couldn't keep. She'd hoped the causeway would survive. It didn't. The city manager toured part of the island with council members, police, and fire chiefs on Friday and came back humbled. They were stopped by debris before they could reach the West End. Every structure they saw had damage. One-story buildings were obliterated, walls punched in, contents scattered across properties, foundations cracked. Elevated structures survived better structurally, but had their ground floors saturated with salt water, which destroyed air conditioning systems, water heaters, elevators, pool pumps, and vehicles parked underneath. Storm surges of 8 to 15 feet had pushed objects, cars, bicycles, pieces of furniture, a mannequin, into marshes and canals hundreds of yards from where they'd been. The salt water permeated the soil itself. The vegetation that had made Periwinkle Way famous, that living tunnel of buttonwoods and live oaks, was stripped, shredded, or uprooted. The canopy was gone. The island's visual identity had been erased. The death toll on Sanibel reached 4. Across Lee County, which includes Fort Myers, Cape Coral, and the Barrier Islands, at least 54 people died. Florida's total climbed past 149. Insured losses from Hurricane Ian reached an estimated $67 billion, the costliest hurricane in Florida history, and one of the 5 most expensive natural disasters in American history. The head of the Sanibel and Captiva Chamber of Commerce would later tell Newsweek what no one who loved the island wanted to hear. Not a single building on the island had escaped damage. Every unit, every structure was impacted by either flood or wind or both. Then came the economic reckoning. Before Ian, Sanibel had close to 2,000 hotel rooms. Within days of the storm, that number fell to 14. Not 1,400. 14 rooms on the entire island. Restaurants were gutted, shops were destroyed, the vacation rental market collapsed. For an island where tourism isn't just the primary industry, but essentially the only industry, the loss was total. Workers lost their jobs. Businesses that had operated for decades closed permanently. The economic devastation threatened to outlast the physical damage. Emergency crews built temporary road access within 15 days of the storm, 12 days ahead of schedule, a remarkable feat. But the permanent rebuild would take until mid-2025 and cost $328 million, using techniques like steel sheet pile walls running 20 to 70 feet deep and around-the-clock construction shifts. Periwinkle Way, the road that used to feel like driving through a private forest, was exposed to open sky. The canopy that had taken decades to grow was stripped or flattened, and with it went the entire visual identity of the island. Visitors who returned months later described Sanibel as unrecognizable. Ground-level structures, homes, shops, restaurants, of which there were many on Sanibel thanks to its long history and the community's deliberate avoidance of anything tall or flashy, were either destroyed outright or flooded with salt water that bred mold within days. Interiors were ruined. Personal belongings, clothes still in closets, art still on walls, sat in homes no one could yet enter. A skeleton in sunglasses appeared outside the closed Kona Kai Motel with a sign that read, "Just waiting for the insurance check." Chauncey Goss, Porter Goss's son, who still lived on the island, had water reach shoulder height inside his house. Everything was ruined. When he tried to get a small business administration disaster loan, the bureaucracy proved nearly as destructive as the storm. He submitted photographs of documents, only to be told the files needed to be PDFs, then scanned copies. Then he asked disaster center employees to help scan, and was told they couldn't. This was the reality for thousands of Sanibel residents, fighting federal paperwork with no home office, no power, and no patience left. A year after the storm, only 1,500 of the island's 6,500 residents were back in their homes. Of more than 500 businesses, about 100 had reopened. Not a single condominium complex had reopened. Buildings stood skeletal among the palms while contractors' trucks rattled up and down streets that used to be the quietest in Florida. One grocery store was running, Jerry's Foods on Periwinkle Way. The island's only school had been relocated to another part of Lee County. The mayor said it would take years, not months. The city manager said the community would rebuild. A commissioner told his own children, "Don't plan on being here for Christmas." And then the insurance reckoning arrived. $620 million in NFIP flood claims. Nearly 100 times the total the program had paid Sanibel homeowners in the previous 40 years. In a matter of hours, the island went from an insurer's dream to a financial nightmare. Older properties at ground level accounted for about 70% of those losses. Under the NFIP's 50% rule, if a house sustains damage equal to half or more of its market value, the owner must elevate the structure to maintain flood insurance. That sounds sensible until you face the actual cost. Often hundreds of thousands of dollars to raise a modest beach house onto stilts. Some homeowners found a workaround that reveals a deeper problem. They requested new property appraisals. With higher assessed values, the damage was less likely to cross the 50% threshold. The house could be repaired without elevation. The insurance stayed in force. But the house was still sitting less than 5 feet above sea level on a barrier island in the Gulf. The next hurricane doesn't check your appraisal. Insurance premiums climbed across the entire state of Florida. Floridians now pay an average of nearly $10,000 a year for homeowners insurance, the highest in the nation. On barrier islands, the numbers run higher still. Several Florida-based insurers went insolvent after Ian. Major national carriers pulled back or stopped writing policies in the state altogether. At its pre-Ian peak, the average Sanibel home was worth nearly $1.3 million. By mid-2025, that figure had dropped to about $868,000. 93% of homes were selling below list price. And then, just as momentum was building, Hurricanes Helene and Milton struck Florida in 2024. Neither hit Sanibel as hard as Ian, but the damage was enough to push back construction timelines, re-damage businesses that had just reopened, and confirm the growing fear that this wasn't a freak event. The Mucky Duck, a beloved waterfront restaurant on Captiva that had actually survived Ian's interior flooding and reopened early, earning the nickname the Lucky Duck, was filled with sand up to its windows by the later storms. The recovery that residents hoped would take 2 years stretched past 3. By late 2025, the island had pushed past the halfway mark. 72% of chamber member businesses had reopened, up from just 25% in February 2024 and 50% by early 2025. Hotel rooms climbed back to about 1,771, still short of the pre-Ian total of 2,458, but real and growing. Vacation rentals were at 77% of prior inventory. The Shalimar Beach Resort reopened as the first newly constructed hotel on Sanibel in more than 4 decades. 33 rooms, fully rebuilt to modern hurricane codes, a symbol of what the new Sanibel might look like. Doc Ford's Rum Bar celebrated its 20th year. The Lazy Flamingo returned to its original building. The Lighthouse Cafe reopened in April 2025, welcoming back a wooden sign that a loyal patron had recovered from storm debris. The Bubble Room on Captiva finally got permanent power 854 days after Hurricane Ian. The New York Times named Sanibel and Captiva one of the 52 places to visit in 2026. The Causeway was finished and open, its 3 small islands offering beaches and 800 free parking spaces. Tourism was approaching pre-Ian levels. The shells were still washing up every morning. But the deeper math hadn't resolved. Insurance remained unaffordable for many. More storms were always one season away. Property values hadn't recovered. The demographics were shifting. Some longtime owners, especially retirees in their 70s and 80s, were giving up, either moving to assisted living or heading back north to be near family. Younger buyers were taking their place, willing to absorb the risk for a chance at a new Sanibel. But the question they carried with them was unsettling to the people who'd fought the Sanibel Rebellion 50 years earlier. Would the rebuilt island still feel like the old one? The conservation framework that had protected Sanibel for half a century was now generating real friction with residents who wanted to rebuild faster, taller, or differently than the plan allowed. Permitting was slow. Contractors were in short supply, stretched thin across southwest Florida by the sheer volume of post-hurricane reconstruction. New FEMA flood maps required higher base elevations, which pushed some homes above the old height limits, forcing code amendments. The plan, for all its environmental wisdom, had been written for a world where the greatest threat was a developer with a bulldozer, not a Category 4 hurricane followed by 2 more storms in 2 years. On neighboring Captiva, a fight had broken out over proposed changes to building height limits at the South Seas resort. More than 13,000 people signed a petition opposing the amendments, arguing that taller, denser construction would make the Barrier Island community less resilient, not more. Porter Goss, now in his elder statesman years, the same man who'd launched a newspaper, organized a rebellion, and become the first mayor of a city that shouldn't have existed, acknowledged the tension. He'd watched the Jersey Shore change beyond recognition after Superstorm Sandy, when outside money flooded in and rewrote the character of entire communities. He didn't want that for Sanibel. But he agreed the city needed pragmatic solutions to ease the recovery without abandoning the principles that had made the island what it was. The question hanging over Sanibel isn't whether tourists will come back. They already have. The shelling is still the best in North America, maybe the world. The Ding Darling Refuge is still the largest undeveloped mangrove ecosystem in the country. The lighthouse still stands at Point Ebel, built from iron that was salvaged off the seafloor in 1884. The real question is whether the thing that made Sanibel worth visiting, worth living on, worth protecting, worth spending $1.3 million on a modest house with no streetlights, whether that thing can survive what's coming. Not the next hurricane specifically, but the accumulating cost of living on a barrier island in an era when the water is rising, the storms are intensifying, the insurance market is fracturing, and the economics of coastal life are being recalculated by forces that no comprehensive plan, no matter how visionary, was ever designed to handle. Sanibel is the same physical size as Manhattan. Manhattan has 1.6 million people. Sanibel chose 6,500. That choice defined everything: the beauty, the value, the quiet, the vulnerability. The island fought off 90,000 people. It couldn't fight off the sea. Drive the causeway today and you cross 3 miles of new steel and fresh concrete. The water on both sides impossibly blue, pelicans diving. The toll is $6 with a transponder, $9 without. You come off the bridge and turn left onto Periwinkle Way, and the trees are coming back, but they aren't what they were. Not yet, not for a decade, maybe longer. Some lots are cleared to bare sand. Some houses sit on new stilts that weren't there before, raised 10 or 12 feet in the air, their front steps climbing like ladders. The light hits different now because the canopy is thinner and the sky is wider than it used to be. Keep driving west and you pass the refuge, where the roseate spoonbills and white ibis are still fishing in the mangroves, and the alligators still sun themselves on the banks of Wildlife Drive. And the sky at dusk still turns a shade of pink that makes people pull over and stand there without speaking. Then you reach the Gulf beaches, and the shells are scattered across the sand in concentrations that exist almost nowhere else on Earth, delivered overnight by currents that have been doing this for 6,000 years and will keep doing it long after the last house on Sanibel is gone. And someone is there. Probably a couple from Michigan or Ohio, probably in their 60s, probably here for the 20th winter in a row, or the first winter since the storm, bent at the waist, eyes on the waterline, doing the Sanibel stoop, as if the sea always gives back what it takes.